A blinding tear of neon blue plasma ripped through the night sky. An alien Vanguard assault skiff, wrapped in a multi-spectral cloaking field, dropped silently into the pitch-black landscape in a dead vertical descent. Its anti-gravity drives had barely kicked up a wave of scorching thermal wash, not even enough time to bake the mud below, when a heavy airboat, plastered in foul-smelling muck and screaming with the deafening roar of a Chevy V8, came barreling out of the dark at 70 miles an hour. It smashed right through that supposedly impenetrable stealth barrier like it was cheap glass. The alien commander, who just a second ago was arrogantly preparing to tag these coordinates on his tactical display, got launched by the raw, violent kinetic energy and violently planted face first into 3 feet of murky, stinking swamp water. Chuck spat out a wad of pulverized chewing tobacco, planted his boot square on the alien's high-tech titanium chest plate, and hollered over his shoulder at his buddy in the airboat. "Jimmy, grab the scattergun. How the hell do we get another batch of these glowing invasive swamp toads? They're more of a pain in the ass than them damn Burmese pythons." The commander's pride and joy, his personal energy shield, short-circuited like crazy under a thick coating of Miami's humid, rotting muck. It popped off a cloud of acrid sparks before dying into a useless slab of scrap metal. Chuck casually jammed a mud-caked snake tong right into the armor joint at Zarl's neck, hoisting him up half an inch like a freshly caught python. Zarl let out a muffled grunt, his core muscles snapping tight. His gauntlet-clad right hand dropped to the plasma sidearm holstered at his thigh. His knuckles had barely wrapped around the cold grip when Chuck's free, mud-slathered hand chopped down viciously on his wrist bone. A sickening crunch drowned out the alien's weird squeal of pain, sending the plasma pistol flying into the air, only for Chuck to snatch it mid-flight. That finely tuned piece of plasma weaponry was still spitting live arcs in his palm. It burned hot enough to make him cuss, and with a swift backhand, he slammed the whole damn gun straight down into the ankle-deep muck. The thick sludge swallowed the weapon instantly. It flashed a violent purplish-blue strobe 3 times, hissed out an ear-piercing short circuit, and went dead quiet in under 2 seconds. Didn't even have the decency to spit another spark. Zarl's remaining hand was still flailing wildly, desperately trying to trigger the emergency beacon on the side of his helmet. Chuck just twisted the snake tongs another half-turn tighter. The pain sent every bionic joint in the alien's body into violent tremors, leaving him hanging limp against the metal jaws. Chuck shifted his weight, freeing up a foot, right about to holler at Jimmy, who was still fishing for hardware near the airboat's pilot seat, to come tie this freak up. But out of the corner of his eye, Chuck caught 3 faint blue silhouettes, practically dissolving into the night fog, silently flanking them through the mud. Jimmy was leaning hard against the blistering exhaust manifold of the Chevy V8, his fingertips tracing the rusted iron sights of his Remington pump action. His peripheral vision caught the same 3 wisps of pale blue reflection floating over the mud, blending perfectly with the swamp mist on their blind side. He didn't yell. His boot soles kicked off the diamond tread steel deck, and he plunged straight into waist-deep compost mud with a deer-hunting spotlight slung over his shoulder. The Remington stock pulled tight into his shoulder pocket. Sunken branches scraped against his Carhartts as he thumbed off the spotlight's safety and pressed the heavy-duty switch all the way down. A million lumens of blinding cold white light punched a hole straight through the swamp fog. The point man's multi-spectral cloaking field didn't even last half a second. It shriveled and burned away like melted plastic wrap, exposing a silver-gray carapace beneath. The compound eye sensors on his helmet started smoking with a nasty burning hair stench. A sharp, distinctly non-human scream ripped through the night as the scout face planted rigid into the slop. The remaining 2 scouts panicked, raising their plasma rifles to fire. Jimmy snapped his wrist, sweeping the beam across them, pinning their sensor visors dead center with twin pillars of pure glare. 2 deafening blasts rang out, almost overlapping. Both scouts crumpled, dropping their high-tech weapons into the muck, where they hissed and violently sparked out in clouds of purple short-circuit fire. Jimmy gave the spotlight a little shake and hollered back at the boat without turning his head. "Keep a tight grip on them tongs, buddy. The other three spooky bastards are currently rolling around in the mud, looking for their eyeballs." Zeral's tactical wristband suddenly let out an ear-piercing shriek. The three green dots representing his scouts on the holographic projection blew up into blinding red distress markers before the entire squad data link fractured into scrambled garbage. His neck, held in a death grip by the snake tongs, popped and ground with sickening noises. The jagged bone ends of his broken wrist sawed through the inner layer of his armor, dripping purplish alien blood that mixed right into the foul-smelling mud. His brain short-circuited trying to comprehend how a multi-spectral cloaking field ranked in the top 0.1 percentile of all galactic tech got burned out instantly by a low-grade illumination tool held by a primitive carbon-based life form. Fighting off a wave of agonizing blackout-inducing pain, his one good hand desperately clawed at the emergency SOS beacon hidden inside his gauntlet. It was his ace in the hole, deliberately mashed into an armor fold the second he was grabbed, completely overlooked by these two earthlings. He pressed the activation stud with everything he had. Instead of the expected high-energy pulse piercing the atmosphere, the beacon's indicator blinked 3 pathetic times and sprayed a jet of scorched white smoke. Refusing to give up, he mashed the button over and over. The entire beacon chip, drowning in hypersaturated swamp humidity, completely overloaded and crumbled into a handful of burning hot slag. He glared up at the lead gray thunderheads pressing down on the tree line. The hyperdense moisture layer acted like a thick, wet blanket, eating every single high-frequency radio wave alive. Not a single nanometer of signal was getting out past 50 yards. The twitching, unnatural shrieks of his 3 scouts echoed through the thick, sticky air. Their dropped plasma weapons were still discharging under the mud, casting erratic purple flickers across Zeral's trembling visor. He couldn't hail the assault skiff. He couldn't contact the orbital support fleet. The Vanguard's entire tactical matrix had shattered so completely in this waist-deep shithole that he couldn't even stitch together a single working command code. The muscles in his jaw locked up involuntarily. Deep in his oral glands, a highly corrosive acid, potent enough to melt through 4 inches of solid titanium, was rapidly pressurizing. He was going to melt this lower carbon-based life form that was currently rubbing his elite squad's face in the dirt into a bubbling puddle of gore. Just as he stealthily popped the exhaust seal under his helmet a fraction of a millimeter, Zaral locked eyes with Chuck staring right back down at him. Chuck didn't waste time talking. His knuckles went white as he clamped the snake tongs locking mechanism shut. His other hand reached right into the back of his work pants and pulled out a greasy, beaten-up roll of industrial-grade duct tape. Swamp mud from his thumbs smeared across the silver adhesive as he slammed the tape dead over Zeral's visor seal. He went to town, wrapping it round and round with violent force, sealing up even the sensor ports at the top of the helmet tight as a drum. The sharp rip of the duct tape drowned out the sound of Zaral thrashing like a madman inside his helmet. In under 10 seconds, that slightly opened exhaust vent was choked off so completely it couldn't leak half a breath of air. The payload of corrosive acid Zaral had been brewing surged to his throat, only to get choked straight back down his own windpipe. A blinding cloud of acidic vapor bloomed inside the visor, frying his last few backup sensors until they hissed and bled blue smoke. Annoyed that the aliens' kicking legs were clipping the airboat's spotlights, Chuck grabbed a heavy nylon tow rope slung over the gunwale. He lashed 3 dead slip knots around the bleeding wrist and both ankles, braced his boot against the rail for leverage, and hoisted the bastard completely upside down. He left him dangling right behind the blistering hot exhaust pipe of the Chevy V8. Heat waves rolling off the pipe, which had been running hard for half an hour, slammed directly into Zeral's faceplate. The only working temperature gauge left on his wrist unit instantly spiked into the red zone, layering an agonizing chorus of static error alerts across his personal comms. Chuck jammed an unlit cigarette into the corner of his mouth, pointed a finger out toward the 3 twitching scouts out in the slop, and barked at Jimmy, who was just climbing back over the side. "Keep that beam on him for another 2 minutes. Don't let these little shits catch their breath and pull another stunt." 2 miles away, the entire canopy of the mangrove forest suddenly violently bent sideways under a massive, ungodly downdraft. 2 hulking black silhouettes, shrouded in a cold blue energy film, tore through the low-hanging thunderclouds, plummeting toward the swamp floor at breakneck speed. Old Earl was squatting on a tangled web of mangrove roots, hooking bloody venison bait onto a gator snare steel cable. The gale force wind slammed into him, ripping a 3-pound steel hook right out of his grip and burying it with a heavy crack into a tree trunk 2 feet away. He spat out a mouthful of shredded leaves and looked up just in time to see 2 massive chunks of metal, wrapped in glowing blue force fields, crash into the open mud flats half a mile out. The muffled impact shook the muck right beneath his boots. He wiped the swamp grime out of his eyes, squinted at the 2 metallic figures slowly rising from the mud mist, and muttered a string of curses. He wondered when the hell the swamp sprouted this kind of heavy iron prey, and figured the state fish and wildlife boys forgot to tag this new mutated breed. He shoved a waist-high barrel of dynamite bait down through the root gaps, hiding it securely in a submerged hollow. His fingers traced the edge of the hunting knife riding at the small of his back, the blade still stained with dried, dark blood from shaving scales off a 10-foot python last week. He kicked off his rubber boots and slid straight into the muddy water like a ghost. The putrid black sludge swallowed him whole. Only the tip of a black plastic snorkel broke the surface by less than half an inch. He didn't even disturb the duckweed floating on top. The tactical readouts in both mechs flashed crimson simultaneously, and every warning klaxon in the cockpit screamed through the crash-landing tremors. Their lower half-gravity repulsor modules had barely fired for half a second before the viscous muck grabbed hold of them. The reactionary force drove their alloy treads deeper into the decomposing sludge. In under 3 seconds, half a meter of heavy leg armor was entirely swallowed by the jet-black swamp water. The mech squad leader slammed his fist on the console, routing every drop of reserve power straight to the anti-grav engines. But the massive energy overload just caused the cold blue shielding on the hull to spit electric fire, and wherever it touched the mud, it violently erupted into crackling white steam. He raised an arm, trying to activate a shoulder-mounted plasma cannon to clear out the pesky mangrove roots. Instantly, a couple pounds of thick black mud seeped right into the unsealed joints of the arm assembly. The mechanical limb locked up like it was poured full of quickset concrete, hanging frozen in mid-air. Every multispectral sensor got hopelessly blindsided by the hypersaturated humidity and mud mist, washing out into pure white static. It was misidentifying patches of duckweed 3 feet away as unknown threats, while completely missing Old Earl, who was hiding right under that same duckweed with his 1-centimeter snorkel. 2 alien scouts yanked off their overheating sensor helmets, trying to manually diagnose the conduit faults. Out of the corner of their eyes, they suddenly caught sight of a mud-caked hand silently rising up right next to an exposed, softly glowing liquid coolant line on the outer leg armor. The tempered edge of the hunting knife caught a flicker of cold light leaking from the cockpit, and with a sharp, brutal snap, it severed the coolant line clean through. Neon glowing cryogenic fluid blasted straight into the boiling mud, sending up a geyser of white steam. The master consoles in both mechs immediately shrieked with maximum level thermal overload alarms. The engine temperature gauges visibly spiked past the red line. One of the panicked scouts reached out to plug the ruptured line with his hand, only for his exposed fingers to instantly erupt into a mess of bloody freeze blisters from the residual spray, sending him slamming backward into the bulkhead in agony. In less than 10 seconds, the mech's outer hulls spiked to over 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The duckweed plastered to their legs instantly curled and scorched, and the mud around them began to simmer and hiss. The blistering alloy shells pumped out an abnormal, metallic-smelling wave of thermal radiation that rippled outward across the water, radiating deep into the pitch-black mangrove woods. Old Earl wiped the cryogenic fluid off his blade onto his Carhartts. His fingers had just hooked onto a mangrove breathing root to pull himself back to his submerged trench, when every hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. More than 30 giant, breeding season alligators were charging hard straight toward the thermal wake rolling off the boiling water. The murky surface churned into a frenzy of thrashing claws and scales, churning up deep black bubbles from the bottom. Earl muttered a low son of a bitch and immediately sank his upper half back into the muck, leaving only his nose and the rubber mouthpiece sticking out. The Alpha, a massive 14-foot bull gator, was the first to launch itself onto the Mechs hull. Its exposed teeth clamped down on alloy plating that was cooking at close to 2,000 degrees, instantly searing the beast's mouth with a hiss of burning flesh. It didn't even blink. It just whipped its 2-ton body around and initiated a death roll. The side armor, already compromised by system overloads, popped its rivets with a violent crack. The entire steel plate was ripped clean off and slammed into the mud, throwing up a geyser of scalding slop. The warning klaxons in both mechs shrieked themselves into static as the shoulder-mounted plasma cannons completely shorted out in the extreme heat, spewing showers of sparks from exposed wiring. The rest of the gator swarm piled on, layering themselves over the mech's half-sunken chassis. The ear-splitting screech of tearing metal completely drowned out everything else. The very second one of the cockpit hatches was cracked open by a panic-stricken scout inside. The biggest bull gator shoved its snout right into the gap. It clamped onto the scout's combat harness and thrashed violently, yanking the tall alien vanguard straight out of the mech and dragging him into the deep water before he could even struggle. A massive whirlpool of oily black water violently swallowed him up. The second mech's hatch buckled immediately under the sheer crushing weight of the reptile swarm. The remaining 2 alien soldiers inside didn't even manage to squeeze out a single scream before they were dragged down into the waist-deep sludge by a mob of thrashing gators. Hung upside down from the Chevy V8's rear bumper, blood rushed to Zeryl's head, making his broken neck throb violently. Harsh, rattling gasps leaked from the duct-tape sealed crack on his visor. Staring past the churning swamp water, now slick with greasy pools of dark green mech coolant, he watched 2 heavy siege mechs, units he had personally authorized with the highest combat rating, get crumpled up like cheap aluminum cans in the boiling mud. Over 30 full-grown alligators had their jaws locked onto titanium armor seams, and the raw torque of their death rolls ripped half a cockpit shell clean off and sent it flying. 3 scouts decked out in full high-dimensional combat armor were dragged into a boiling vortex of black water before they could even transmit a single electromagnetic distress signal. Not one of those shoulder-mounted plasma cannons had managed to fire a single shot. He fought like a madman against the thick nylon rope digging into his broken wrists, the jagged bone grinding against his armor lining and dripping bloody mud. He had run combat simulations against every conceivable resistance element, kinetic rifles, anti-tank missiles, orbital defense cannons, but not a single page in any operational manual had ever classified a 3-ton carbon-based swamp reptile as a Class A anti-armor threat. He cranked his last functional sensor to maximum output. The red dots on his screen, marking Vanguard combat units, blinked out one by one until the signals for his 3 twitching shock troopers a few miles out finally flatlined. The interstellar tactical matrix head spent a century building shattered like a windshield, catching a sledgehammer. Every preconceived logic of victory was ground down to absolute dust. He tensed every muscle in his body and thrashed wildly, his upside-down frame slamming against the blistering exhaust pipes with heavy metallic clangs. He threw himself around so hard the edges of the industrial tape over his mouth began to buckle. Just as his blurry vision pierced the thick rain fog, he saw it. Out beneath the lead gray clouds to the southeast, the first flash of dark purple thruster wash tore through the saturated humidity. A colossal metallic shadow was bearing down heavily over the entire swamp. The hairs on the back of Jimmy's neck suddenly shriveled against a blast of incoming heat. He looked up past the dreary gray rain clouds to the southeast, watching that same dark purple thruster glow Zaral was staring at balloon in size. Half an alien assault carrier, sheathed in dark silver armor, breached the humidity layer. Underslung beneath its belly were 6 massive thermal water extractors, spinning up pale blue energy vortexes that literally warped the air with heat. Dangling from the bumper, Zaral began violently convulsing. The thick nylon ropes binding his ankles groaned under the strain, and his acidic spit burned tiny holes right through the edges of the heavy-duty tape sealing his mouth. He was squealing into his throat like a wild boar with a boot on its neck. Jimmy ignored him, flicked on his million-lumen deer spotlight, and aimed that blinding white beam straight at the carrier's hull, making its multispectral cloaking field pop and violently spark with purple electricity. A split second later, a low-frequency tremor shot straight up through the soles of his boots from the drying mud. All 6 thermal extractors kicked into overdrive. The swamp water for 5 miles in every direction looked like it was being yanked down by an invisible giant hand. The ankle-deep, murky water lapping at Jimmy's boots drained bone dry in half a minute. The exposed black muck baked under the heat, cracking open into fissures half a finger wide. Baby gators, water snakes, and massive mole crickets scrambled frantically for damp cover. Jimmy casually booted a water moccasin that lunged at his foot 3 yards out of the way. In under 3 minutes, water that used to sit past the hull's keel disappeared, laying bare the deeply tangled root system of the entire mangrove forest. Decades of rotting compost baked in the heat, giving off a choking, burnt stench that sent a flock of wood storks, previously sunning on a distant log, scrambling into the sky in an absolute panic. Motherfucker, these tin can bastards are trying to bake our swamp into a damn biscuit. Jimmy bellowed back at Chuck. The heavy wrench in Chuck's hand, which he had been just about to crack over Zaral's helmet, clattered hard against the aluminum deck. He stared at the rapidly shrinking waterline, his face looking mean enough to bite through nails. Half a mile away on the newly dried mudflats, Old Earl was hauling that waist-high barrel of dynamite bait, hoofing it toward them at a dead sprint. Right on his heels were 3 full-grown alligators, dizzy from the heat, but wagging their tails and following him like a pack of loyal hound dogs. Chuck scooped up the civilian CB radio by his foot, a beat-up rig wrapped in 3 layers of waterproof tape. He smacked the casing twice to knock out the static. The heavy rumble of the Chevy V8 vibrated right through the airboat frame into the radio, immediately pulling in a chorus of cursing swamp hunters bleeding through the background noise. Chuck planted a boot on the mud rail and yelled loud enough to drown out the whining extractors overhead. "Listen up, every last son of a bitch running a boat in the glades. Them glowing tin-plated bastards in the sky are draining our swamp dry. We let 'em do this, and we won't even have a gator nest to raid next year. I need everybody on my coordinates right damn now, and bring every piece of hardware you got that blows steel to pieces." Chuck slammed the radio back onto the deck. He looked up and saw a thick pillar of black exhaust punching through the mangrove gaps to the east. It was Old Tom's supercharged, 454 horsepower airboat. Its prop was shaving off the newly hardened mud, dragging 2 massive rooster tails of dirt behind it. From the south, 3 more boats busted through, their gunwales strapped tight with hunting rifles and poison-tipped harpoons. The engine roar from half a mile out was loud enough to rattle your teeth. In less than 30 seconds, a fleet of over 20 heavy-duty airboats, all packing massive displacement V8 engines, came screaming out of every river bend and mudflat. The waves of kicked-up dirt rolling off their wakes merged into a solid yellow-brown wall across the drying swamp. Not a single boat let off the throttle, barreling straight toward the drop zone right underneath the hovering alien assault carrier. By then, Old Earl had hauled himself aboard, dragging the 3 dizzy gators over the rail by the scruff of their necks. He slammed the big barrel of dynamite down by Chuck's boots with a heavy thud. The three Gators just shook their muddy heads and lay flat on the deck, flicking their tongues with zero intention of biting a damn thing. When the main console on the alien assault carrier threw its first shower of blue sparks, all 6 thermal extractors were still blasting scalding white steam into the air at max capacity. The scout on duty frantically slapped at his touch panels. The data streams from the multispectral sensors had completely fractured into blocky mosaic garbage. The low-frequency resonance from 20 massive V8 combustion engines had utterly blown out the fire control system's filter modules. The sonar arrays were choked with the deafening thud of propellers smacking against hardened mud. There wasn't a single data point that matched a standard hostile unit signature from the Interstellar Tactical Manual. His fingers flew across the holographic display, desperately trying to establish a target lock. The terminal simply hissed out white smoke and burned his fingertips, forcing him to recoil. Max energy shields. Full power. The acting commanding officer booted the error, spewing console out of his way. His roar was instantly swallowed by the omnipresent low-frequency vibrations that made his chest cavity ache. A massive, pale blue hemispherical energy dome flared to life directly over the carrier's landing zone. Immediately, the towering wave of yellow-brown mud whipped up by the charging airboats slammed brutally against the energy barrier. Every single glob of mud, packed with conductive dirt and highly corrosive swamp acid, exploded in blinding purple-blue electrical arcs on impact. The shield's energy readouts plummeted at a terrifying rate, setting off a chaotic symphony of warning alarms across the bridge. A few scouts manning the shoulder-mounted plasma cannons were riding the firing buttons hard, but the fire control system couldn't grab a lock on a single moving target through the absolute chaos of erratic thermal signatures bouncing off the mud. Those mud-caked iron boats didn't even register as solid outlines on radar. They looked like 20 animated, pissed-off mud monsters charging straight at the front lines. Someone panicked and lunged to rip the emergency power cables loose. Hyper-saturated moisture snuck right into the cooling vents on the circuit boards, causing an entire row of power modules to blow out in a cascade of burning sparks. Dangling upside down off Chuck's boat, Zarl peered through the acid-burned holes of his helmet at his tactical display, watching red dots glitch wildly across the screen. His broken wrist ground against the nylon ropes, bleeding freely. He had memorized the Vanguard combat regulations back to front, but nowhere from page 1 to the appendix was there a contingency for an armed cluster of 20 civilian combustion engines launching a literal mud tsunami charge. A garbled whimper leaked from his tape-sealed mouth. The severed bones in his neck throbbed from the blood rushing to his head, and whatever was left of his elite arrogance shattered like cheap glass under a heavy V8 tire. Old Earl had the heels of his boots wedged deep into the rebar slots, welded to the front deck. The relentless thumping of the V8 engine vibrated right into his molars, and the python blood-stained hunting knife at his waist rattled like crazy. He spat out a soggy, bitter cigarette butt and hoisted up the first bucket of homemade dynamite hidden in dead gator meat. His rough, calloused hands gripped the tin barrel so hard it dented. Across the 20-plus boats flanking them, every hunter raised their arms in total sync. Poison-tipped harpoons whistled through the air first, burying themselves straight into the weakest points of the energy shield where the electrical sparking was heaviest. Corrosive acid from the mud dripped down the harpoon shafts, sending massive ripples of failure across the already overloaded energy field. Channeling all the wrist-strength head-built wrestling pythons for a decade, Old Earl hurled his dynamite bucket right on the tail of the harpoons. The waist-high tin barrel slammed perfectly flat against the pale blue energy barrier with a resounding smack, sticking to it like glue. He slung 3 barrels back-to-back with freakish accuracy. Every single one snagged dead center on the shield's overloaded power nodes. Following his lead, the rest of the hunters launched their bait barrels in a brutal volley of consecutive thuds. In less than 30 seconds, the entire hemispherical shield was completely plastered. You couldn't even see a sliver of pale blue light through the wall of junk. Old Earl wiped a glob of mud out of his eye and hollered back at Chuck, who had the throttle pinned to the floorboard. "Back it up 30 yards. When this rig blows, the mud's gonna splatter for half a mile." As the fleet of airboats threw it in reverse, the violent purple-blue arcs dancing along the overloaded shield crawled right up the metal barrels and licked the fuses. Hissing sparks chewed their way past the waterproof tape, tangling directly with the collapsing energy field. Dangling upside down from the tow rope at the back of the boat, Zarrell's vision wobbled through the exhaust heat haze just in time to see the fuses light up. The deafening chain reaction of explosions whipped him around like a rag doll on a clothesline. The ropes yanked his shoulder joint with a sickening pop, while his headset blew up with the panicked screams of the carrier's 12-man crew layered over the screech of every instrument flatlining at once, making his skull throb with agony. The pale blue energy shield didn't hold for a fraction of a second. It spider-webbed straight from the contact points of the dynamite and shattered instantly into a sky full of glowing blue shrapnel. The concussive force of dozens of homemade explosive barrels swept up tons of swamp muck, half-rotted chunks of gator meat, and wrist-thick mangrove roots into a 40-foot tidal wave of sludge. The whole mess slammed squarely into the alien thermal extractors lining the edge of the LZ. The light alloy casings were instantly cratered by rock impacts, and every sealed conduit snapped like a twig. Heavy black mud, loaded with ultra-corrosive humic acid, flooded straight into the mechanical guts. The circuit boards completely blew out in sheets of blue fire, and the red warning lights barely managed 2 pathetic flashes before dying out into dead, lifeless gray. Scalding globs of mud rained down heavily on Zarrell's visor, smearing his vision into a cloudy, muddy brown. He desperately tried to engage the high-dimensional tactical protocols hardwired into his neural synapses to analyze the combat scenario. But every single logic block holding the interstellar combat codes and the glory of the Vanguard force fried like a microchip dropped in a puddle, hissing white short-circuit smoke into his brain. It took him 3 full seconds to process a single, devastating reality. 300 years of intensive training across a dozen star systems was absolutely, utterly useless in the mud pits of South Florida. The very last sound that squeaked through his earpiece was the bridge operator screaming so loud, his vocal cords tore like ripped plastic. Multispectral sensors are completely blinded. Mud in the plasma cooling loops. Fire up the anti-grav engines and bug out. Pull up. Pull up. The toe of Chuck's boot gently kicked the dangling alien's shoulder. Zarrell's dislocated bone crunched, sending him drawing sharp, pained breaths inside his tape-sealed helmet. Chuck barely noticed, his eyes tracking the violently shaking alien assault carrier up ahead. Jimmy racked 2 heavy brass buckshot shells into his Remington with a satisfying clack. Keeping the million-lumen beam locked tight on the purple light bleeding from the hull, he yelled, "These sons of bitches think they're just gonna waltz on out of here?" Chuck didn't answer. He just tapped his fingers against the blistering hot cast-iron block of his Chevy V8. Out across the swamp, the carrier's anti-grav engines suddenly roared to life, lifting the wounded ship half a meter off the ground. Its massive underbelly thrusters kicked into full suction, trying to pull air. But that insane intake force just inhaled everything in the mud pit below. Over a dozen dazed pythons, 3 half-grown gators, and literal tons of wet slurry got violently sucked right off the ground and jammed straight into the high-speed turbine blades. The screech of tearing metal sliced through the damp swamp air. The grinding crunch of python bones and gator teeth completely locking up the turbine was loud enough for Chuck to hear clearly from half a mile away. A massive sheet of electrical fire blew out the ship's viewports. Shards of multi-spectral sensors and blackened plasma coolant rained down the sides of the hull. In under a second, every illuminated instrument panel on the ship went pitch black. The now powerless hunk of junk didn't even make it 60 feet in the air before banking hard sideways. Like a wild boar taking a slug right between the eyes, it violently crashed into the deep mangroves, the heavy thud flushing hundreds of white egrets out of the swamp in a massive flock. Chuck's spine was still soaking up the residual heat radiating off his V8 engine. He had just brought a sweating can of cheap beer to his lips when the heavy, tree-shaking thud of the crash finally echoed over. Hundreds of white egrets exploded from the canopy, soaring past his boat in a flurry of white wings. One of them knocked a mud-splattered mangrove leaf loose, floating right down into the foam of his beer can. Dangling by his boots, Zaral was still twitching. His dislocated shoulder bounced around like a busted toy on a clothesline. The heat off the exhaust pipe baked the last remnants of his suit's force field into hissing white steam, curling up the edges of the gray duct tape over his mouth. Jimmy squatted by the rail, ejecting the spent shells from his Remington, his muddy fingers smudging the bright brass buckshot. Old Earl paddled his leaky, half-sunken iron skiff right out from the mangrove gaps. He had half a freshly killed python sprawled across the deck, and his mouth was twisted up tighter than a duck-hunting decoy. That pile of scrap metal just smashed right on top of 3 of my damn gator traps. Ain't no way these bastards got the money to pay for that. Chuck ignored him. He freed up a hand and grabbed the CB radio bound in waterproof tape, twisting the dial until it clicked sharply onto the county sheriff's open frequency. Beer foam dripped down his stubble, but he didn't bother wiping it. His rough, gravelly southern drawl cut right through the static. "Hey, Sheriff." "It's Chuck." The voice on the other end was muffled by pillows, groggy and packed with 4 a.m. attitude. "Chuck, why the hell are you waking me up at 4:30 in the morning? Did you blow up another tourist's RV on that gator tag I just approved last week? I'm telling you right now, that's a $200 fine minimum." Chuck looked out over the fleet of 20-odd heavy airboats lined up perfectly across the water. More than 40 swamp hunters were leaning on their rails, chomping on cigars and waving at him. Pale blue alien blood was still dripping from the tips of their harpoons, fizzing into tiny white bubbles where it hit the mud. Zaral, hanging by Chuck's boots, found a burst of phantom energy and thrashed again. His dislocated shoulder let out a sickening crack, followed by a weird, muffled whimper. Chuck casually shifted his boot and tapped the wounded shoulder, instantly shutting the alien up. "Ain't an RV." Chuck popped the tab on his beer, spraying foam all over his pant leg. "Got us a whole flock of purple glowing invasive scrap metal. Don't know where the hell they floated in from, but they tried to drain 5 miles of our swamp to build some illegal zoning crap. We took care of him. None of the locals got hurt, just tore up a patch of reeds." Dead silence on the radio for 3 seconds, followed by a string of curses loud enough to make the speaker crackle. "Chuck, I'm warning you, don't feed me another one of your bullshit ghost stories. Last month you said there was a swamp monster in the lake and tricked me into sending 2 excavators out there. We fished out 30 crates of moonshine, and I still haven't settled that tab with you. I swear on a gator's grave I ain't lying." Chuck chuckled, pointing a finger at the thick plumes of pale blue smoke rising from the mangroves. "Don't send out the regular sanitation trucks. Call the city and get that giant garbage rig that can chew up a whole palm tree and bring plenty of heavy gauge wire. Might take 3 trips to haul all the pieces out of the woods. I got their head honcho tied up right here by my boots. I'll drag him back on the trailer. You can toss him in a museum or the landfill. I don't give a damn." He didn't wait for the sheriff to keep yelling, just slammed the radio face down on the muddy deck. The morning sun was just starting to paint the waist-deep muck in warm gold. A few half-ton alligators swam lazily past the boat, wagging their tails and migrating toward the wreckage of the carrier. Deep in the trees, the intermittent sound of alien crewmen banging against bulkheads echoed softly, blending perfectly with the chorus of swamp frogs. Staring through his heavily scratched visor at the flock of egrets circling overhead, Zaral realized the Interstellar Expeditionary Tactical Manual he spent 3 centuries helping calibrate wasn't even worth using as toilet paper in the mud pits of Florida. Jimmy hoisted his loaded Remington over his shoulder and tipped his chin at the smoking tree line. "Want to take a spin in there before the garbage trucks show up?" Old Earl says his backyard grill is missing a high-temp ignition starter. Chuck chucked his empty beer can with dead accuracy into a patch of duckweed and grabbed the helm of the V8 airboat. The engine instantly roared to life, shaking the leaves out of the trees. Across the water, 20-plus heavy airboats fired up in unison, their propellers churning up a unified wall of mud slamming against the hulls. "Damn straight." He cranked the throttle, the bow slicing aggressively through the muck as they bolted for the trees, the wind snapping hard at his plaid shirt. "Let's find an unbroken plasma gun to rip out for the grill. Next time we roast gator legs, I guarantee they'll be crispy on the outside and tender on the inside, and we won't even have to pay for charcoal." The deafening roar of the engines completely drowned out the miserable screams of the alien scouts. The wind whipping across the Florida Everglades smelled like nothing but diesel fumes and cheap beer.
Man, I can't get over that image. A highly trained alien commander, a guy who conquered star systems, duct-taped and dangling upside down behind a blistering Chevy V8 exhaust pipe. Hell yeah. And don't even get me started on the Gators doing death rolls on high-tech mechs. That is just pure badass Florida energy right there. You just don't mess with the swamp. So, let me ask you guys, if an alien Vanguard crash landed in your own backyard tonight, what's the craziest local junk you'd use to welcome them? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe for more crazy HFY stories, and I'll catch you on the next one.